SWAT storms Grandma's house by mistake. She wins $4 million in court. Evelyn was just starting her morning like any other. The sun had barely risen, casting soft golden light over her small backyard. At 72, she moved slower than she used to, but with the same care. She hummed a quiet tune as she gently picked at weeds around her tomato plants, her garden gloves already damp with morning dew. The tomatoes were nearly ready, big, red, and perfect. She smiled to herself, thinking how much her neighbor's little girl loved them in her mom's pasta sauce. She looked up, wiping her hands on her apron, and took a deep breath. The air was cool and still. It was quiet, peaceful, just like it always had been on this street she'd lived on for over 4 decades. Inside, her kettle was whistling softly. Evelyn walked back into her kitchen, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat at the small wooden table by the window. She pulled out her crossword book. She never missed a day. She was thinking about what to cook for dinner when it happened. A loud, sudden crash shook the entire house. The teacup spilled, the windows rattled. Evelyn froze. Before she could even stand up, her front door flew open, slammed off its hinges. Loud boots hit the floor. Shadows moved fast. She could hear men shouting, "Police! Hands where we can see them!" and the thudding of gear against walls. Evelyn stood in the hallway, eyes wide, still in her bathrobe, her hands slightly raised in fear and confusion. She didn't understand. 1 second she was sipping tea. The next, her quiet little home, was full of armed men dressed in black, rifles drawn, barking commands like she was dangerous. She wasn't. She was just Evelyn, a widow, a grandmother, someone who still used paper recipes and fed stray cats. A voice yelled, "Get on the ground!" Evelyn's knees buckled as her body gave out. 2 officers grabbed her, pulled her arms behind her back, and forced her to the floor. Her face pressed against the hardwood she'd polished just the day before. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. She cried out, not loud, more like a sharp breath of disbelief. "Please, I live here," she said, but no one seemed to hear. From the floor, all she could do was watch. Watch as her home, the place she and her late husband had built a life in, was being torn apart. Officers moved from room to room, flipping furniture, breaking drawers, kicking open closets. She saw one officer knock over a picture frame, the one of her husband in his old postal uniform. The glass cracked as it hit the ground. She closed her eyes. This isn't real, she thought. She didn't know how long it lasted, minutes or hours. Time had stopped, but she knew what it felt like: shame, fear, confusion, humiliation. Eventually, the shouting quieted. Someone said, "There's nothing here." Another voice muttered, "Wrong address." And just like that, they started leaving. Just like they came in. One officer removed her cuffs and helped her sit up. "Ma'am, there's been a mistake," he said. His face was pale. He looked sorry, but Evelyn didn't answer. She couldn't. She was looking around at the pieces of her life: shattered glass, torn-up cushions, recipe cards scattered across the kitchen floor like fallen leaves. Her chest felt tight. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Outside, neighbors had gathered. She could see them staring from the sidewalk, whispering, phones out. Some looked angry. Others looked scared. A few just looked heartbroken. One officer stepped forward and tried to speak. "We had information about a suspect wrong. Ouse." But Evelyn cut him off with a whisper. "I know who I am." But clearly you didn't. She stood slowly, wrapped her robe tighter, and walked back inside, stepping over broken glass, spilled coffee, and the pieces of her safe little world. In that moment, everything Evelyn had built over 45 years was shattered because of a mistake. The broken door still hung crooked on its hinges, barely attached, letting in the morning breeze and distant voices of concerned neighbors. But across town, inside a brightly lit, heavily guarded police station, there was no time for regret. Not yet. Earlier that morning, hours before Evelyn heard the crash, a small group of officers sat inside a conference room filled with tension. Screens on the wall showed blurry photos, maps, and a blinking red dot that moved slowly through a part of the city they didn't often patrol. Captain Marshall stood at the front of the room. At 3 a.m., a truck carrying illegal weapons was hijacked off I-95. We've got intel suggesting the people responsible are planning to distribute both the guns and a large amount of narcotics within city limits. We're under pressure to act, fast. The officers shifted in their seats. The red dot on the map flickered again. It had stopped somewhere in a residential neighborhood, Evelyn's neighborhood, Cedar Street. One officer raised her hand, voice cautious. "Captain, do we have confirmed visuals on any suspect? Any surveillance?" "No time," the captain snapped. "We traced a phone linked to a known gang affiliate." The signal bounced around that block. It landed on one property in particular. Another officer pulled up records on a tablet. "Single-family home, registered to Evelyn Harris, no police history, lived there over 40 years. A silence passed. "Through the room." "Then why target it?" asked a younger officer, frowning. Captain Marshall cleared his throat. "It's not just about the phone. There's been some flagged activity in that neighborhood. Noise complaints, loitering. One of our officers patrolled the area last month and noted suspicious behavior. That could be where they're hiding. Out." Some officers exchanged looks, others nodded. A few weren't sure, but no one challenged the captain out loud. Lieutenant Brooks, a veteran of 20 years, leaned forward. "We don't know who lives in that house. We haven't confirmed anything beyond a phone ping. What if it's the wrong place?" "We can't sit on this, Mike," the captain replied. "We go in, fast, full tactical team." Brooks hesitated. His gut told him it didn't add up. He'd learned over the years that when things don't feel right, they usually aren't. But there was pressure from above. The media was already running stories about missing weapons. The mayor's office was calling for action, and that's how it happened. That's how a quiet home filled with family pictures, tomato seeds, and crossword books became a suspected hideout. A 72-year-old woman's house was raided with military-style force, not because anyone had seen danger inside it, but because someone had guessed, and no one questioned it hard enough to stop it. By the time the team rolled out in armored vehicles, the damage was already written. Back on Cedar Street, hours after the raid, Evelyn sat in her living room, still stunned. Her son had arrived and was gently sweeping up the broken glass. The floor creaked every time he shifted, the silence between them heavy. "Why me?" she asked softly. Her son looked up. "That's what we're going to find out." The police had already begun their own internal scramble. Calls were flying between departments. Reports were being rewritten. Terms like misidentification, faulty data, and unfortunate error were tossed around like bandages on a deep wound. But Evelyn wasn't just a name in a file. She was a person, a mother, a widow, a neighbor. She sat on the edge of her couch, staring down at the dent in the floor where one officer had dropped a metal case. In her lap was a half-torn recipe card. Her handwriting, familiar, patient, full of memories, now smeared and ripped. It wasn't just a card. It was the only copy she had of her mother-in-law's cornbread recipe. Now, lost. At the police station, Lieutenant Brooks finally spoke up again. He pulled his captain aside. "This was wrong. We didn't verify anything. That house never fit the profile." "We followed procedure," the captain said, brushing it off. "Procedure isn't enough when it ruins someone's life," Brooks replied, and deep down, even the captain knew he was right. But damage, once done, isn't erased by apologies typed in reports. It lingers, In the creak of a broken door, the night sweats, the way Evelyn flinched every time she heard footsteps outside. This wasn't just about a wrong address. It was about how easily assumptions became decisions. How Evelyn's quiet home became a target because of the street it was on, and the face they imagined behind that front door. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not because they saw her, but because they failed to look at all. And now, she had to decide what to do next. The house was still, but not in the way it used to be. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was sitting on Evelyn's chest. She hadn't slept the night after the raid, not even a little. Every time she closed her eyes, the scene replayed again. The pounding on the door, the voices shouting, the sound of her favorite dish hitting the floor and breaking into sharp pieces. Her arms still ached from where the cuffs had bitten into her skin. Now, in the dim morning light, she sat on the edge of her bed, wrapped in the same robe she'd worn the day before. It smelled like the floor, like fear. She looked around the room. Her closet was wide open, clothes scattered on the floor like a storm had passed through. Her husband's photo was face down on the dresser, its frame cracked. His gentle smile now hidden. Evelyn reached for it slowly and turned it upright. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "I couldn't stop them." Downstairs, her son had started cleaning. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His silence was loud with anger. The living room was a mess, books thrown off shelves, the corner of the sofa ripped, and the rug they'd bought on their anniversary bunched up like someone had tripped on it during the raid. One of her favorite recipe cards was stuck to the floor with spilled coffee. Outside, the sun was rising again. The neighborhood that had once felt warm now looked unfamiliar through the broken front door. Police vehicles were gone. So were the officers. But the neighbors remained. Some stood across the street, their arms crossed. Others came to the porch offering soft apologies and warm casseroles. But Evelyn didn't feel hungry. And she didn't feel safe. That morning, when she tried to walk into the garden, her legs stopped at the porch step. Her tomato plants, once standing tall and healthy, were now bent, some crushed by muddy footprints. She turned back inside, shut the door the best she could, and sat in her armchair, just staring. She didn't cry, not at first. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. It startled her. Her body tensed like it remembered the day before. Her son opened the door and a woman stepped inside. She was calm, soft-spoken, and introduced herself as Patricia Reynolds, a civil rights attorney. Someone had told her what happened. Evelyn listened quietly as Patricia explained what could be done. A lawsuit, a formal complaint, the chance to make them answer for what they did. Evelyn looked down at her hands, still shaking slightly. "Will that undo it?" she asked. Patricia didn't answer right away. "No," she said softly. "But it will make sure they can't ignore it. And maybe make sure it doesn't happen to the next woman sitting in her kitchen in the morning." Light. That night, Evelyn tried to sleep. She checked the locks twice, then again, then one more time. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every sound outside made her flinch. A car door, a bark, the wind. She missed her husband more than ever. He would have known what to do. He would have held her hand and said, "You're safe now." But those words wouldn't come. Instead, the words that stuck in her mind were the ones she hadn't even said yesterday. The things she wanted to scream while they tore apart her house. "I'm not a threat. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a woman who makes jam and keeps old recipe cards in a tin box. You didn't even see me. You didn't even look." Her son slept on the couch downstairs, keeping watch. That helped a little, but it didn't erase the fear in her bones, or the questions in her heart. The next morning, Evelyn walked into her kitchen and stood by the table. Her crossword book lay untouched. The kettle still had yesterday's water in it. She tried to make tea, but when the steam started rising, her hand began to shake. She dropped the spoon. Her neighbor knocked gently a while later, offering to help clean the garden. Evelyn shook her head. She wasn't ready, because home wasn't home anymore. The SWAT team had come and gone in less than an hour, but what they left behind wasn't just broken furniture. It was broken trust. It was the feeling that even in her own house, with her slippers on and her hair tied back, she could be mistaken for something dangerous just because of where she lived. Or what she looked like. For Evelyn, the hardest part wasn't the mess they left behind. It was the feeling that she had to prove she didn't deserve it in the first place. For days after the raid, Evelyn moved through her house like a ghost. She cleaned things that were already clean. She refolded blankets, straightened photos, rearranged cups, anything to feel like she had control over her space again. But some things couldn't be straightened. The floors still groaned beneath her feet. Her favorite tea mug had been shattered. And every time she glanced at the front door, now patched with plywood, her chest tightened. It looked like a wound. A scar her home would wear for months. She'd lived there over 45 years. She had seen the neighborhood change. New families moving in, kids growing up, old trees cut down. But through it all, Evelyn had stayed. Because this was her place, her safe place. Until it wasn't. Now, even the sound of her own doorbell made her hands shake. At night, she lay in bed and waited for something. Another knock, another crash, another mistake. Sleep came in tiny pieces, broken and restless. Her son stopped, asking how she was. He knew. He could see it in the way she stared off during breakfast, in how she'd start wiping the same spot on the table over and over again. Her rhythm was gone. The routine that had once been her comfort now felt pointless. She hadn't touched her garden. Not once. The tomato plants she loved were shriveled now, their stems snapped from boot prints. The little corner where she'd kept herbs and flowers looked like someone had stomped the life out of it. In a way, that's how Evelyn felt too. It wasn't just about a door being broken down, or the dishes, or the wrecked furniture. It was about what had been taken. The peace, the trust, the dignity. It was the feeling of not being seen. Or worse, being seen and still not mattering. Then, one quiet afternoon, Evelyn sat in her kitchen, sipping lukewarm tea when her son brought someone with him again. The same woman from before, Patricia, the lawyer. She carried a notebook, a calm face, and a voice that didn't rush. This time, Evelyn listened more closely. "I know you didn't ask for any of this," Patricia said softly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "But I also know they shouldn't be allowed to walk away like it never happened." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked around her kitchen instead. At the cracked tile, the dusty counters, the drawers that wouldn't close right anymore. "Do you think anyone would care if I wasn't an old woman?" Evelyn asked, not angry. Just tired. Patricia's eyes didn't flinch. "I think more people care than you know. But sometimes they need someone to remind them. Someone strong enough to say, 'Look what they did to me, and look what they've done to others like me.'" Evelyn sat quietly for a moment, then reached for something on the table, a wrinkled recipe card. It was stained with coffee and torn in one corner. She turned it over, ran her finger across the faded ink. Her mother-in-law's handwriting was still there, just barely. "You see this?" she said, holding it up. This was James's favorite. Every holiday, every birthday, this is what he asked for. His mother taught me how to make it when we were first married. Patricia nodded gently. "They tore through my house like none of it mattered. Like I didn't matter." Evelyn set the card down, flat on the table. "So I'm going to make sure I do. Even if it's the last fight I take on." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. That was the day she decided to go to court. Not just for herself, but for everyone else who'd never had the chance. The people who were too scared, too worn down, too alone. Evelyn had a voice, and she was going to use it. In the weeks that followed, her neighbors rallied around her. Someone brought a carpenter to fix her broken door properly. Someone else replaced her kitchen window. A few teenage boys gently pulled weeds from her garden, while one of the older women brought cuttings from her own plants. People had seen what happened. They weren't going to forget it. The story began spreading, first around the neighborhood, then across the city. A 72-year-old woman wrongfully raided in her own home. Mistaken identity. No warrant served. No questions asked. It stirred something in people, not outrage for outrage's sake, but recognition. That this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. That maybe this time, something had to change. Evelyn sat on her porch again. One evening, finally brave enough to step outside. She looked out at her street, still quiet, still familiar. But something felt different now, not broken, just shifting. She held a notebook on her lap, pages filled with notes from Patricia. Legal language, court dates, damages, rights. But on the first page, Evelyn had written her own words. This isn't about revenge. It's about being seen. It's about being heard. And it's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did, alone. Chatti. Sun dipped low in the sky. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered to herself, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready. The courtroom was colder than Evelyn expected. Not in temperature exactly, but in energy. The walls were tall and pale, the chairs stiff, and everything echoed more than it should. She sat beside Patricia at the long wooden table, her hands folded, in her lap, steady but tense. She wore a navy blue suit her son had bought her for this day. It was simple, elegant, and didn't draw attention. Evelyn didn't want attention. She wanted truth. The bailiff called her name, and the case began. All. Around the room, faces turned. Some curious, some skeptical. A few kind, most unreadable. But Evelyn wasn't there for them. She was there for every quiet voice that had ever been ignored. The city's legal team sat across the aisle. Well-dressed, calm. They didn't look at her directly, just at papers and screens, just at protocols and policies. Patricia opened with a voice that was both gentle and sharp. This case is not just about a door that was broken. It's about a life that was broken into. It's about a woman treated as guilty before anyone bothered to ask if she was even involved. The defense attorney, Mr. Bennett, stood next. His words were smooth. A mistake, he called it. A mix-up of data. He apologized on behalf of the department, but everything about his tone sounded like paperwork, like Evelyn's life, had been an unfortunate typo. Then, they called her to the stand. Evelyn stood slowly and walked to the front, her cane tapping gently against the floor. When she sat down and took the oath, the room went quiet in a way that felt different. Like they were finally about to listen. Patricia approached. Mrs. Harris, can you tell us what happened on the morning of July 15th? Evelyn nodded, her voice soft at first. I was getting ready for the day. Had my robe on. I'd just come in from the garden. I was making tea. She paused, looking toward the jury. Then the door exploded. Just like that. No knock, no warning. Just gone. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. It was calm. Honest. Heavy with quiet dignity. They rushed in with guns. Shouted things I didn't understand. I was confused, scared. I dropped to the floor. They handcuffed me. She rubbed her wrist gently, out of habit. I didn't know what I did wrong. I still don't. They didn't ask me any questions. They didn't stop to look around. They just assumed. One juror wiped at their eye. Another shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Evelyn continued, her words slower now. My husband passed 5 years ago. We built that home together. Every photo on the wall, every dish in the cabinet, every mark on the floor, it all meant something. But they didn't see any of that. Just a target. Bennett stood to cross-examine. Mrs. Harris, you understand the officers were acting on intelligence they believed to be accurate? Evelyn met his gaze. And did that intelligence tell them I was dangerous? Did it tell them I was someone who needed to be thrown on the floor like a criminal? He hesitated. The data led them to your property. Their intent wasn't personal, she nodded slowly. Maybe not, but the result was. I didn't just lose a door. I lost peace. I lost trust. The courtroom stayed silent after she stepped down. The judge, the jury, even the defense. Everyone sat with her words like they were still echoing. Over the next few days, testimony unfolded. Captain Marshall took the stand. He looked uncomfortable in his formal uniform. He admitted the team had acted quickly, that there hadn't been enough time for surveillance, that the phone ping had a margin of error. Regretfully, the operation proceeded under flawed assumptions, he said. When asked why Evelyn's house had been picked from the dozens in the area, he paused. Because it was in a neighborhood where we've had other issues before. Patricia leaned forward. You mean a black neighborhood? Marshall didn't answer. Then came Lieutenant Brooks. He testified with a steady voice. I warned the team. I said it didn't feel right, that we didn't have enough, but the pressure was high, and certain biases, they took over. What kind of biases? Patricia asked. The kind that assumes some neighborhoods are more suspicious than others. That certain people look like suspects without ever doing anything wrong. The final day came. Closing arguments were made. Patricia stood before the jury one last time. This case is about accountability. About how easy it is to see a grandmother in her garden as a threat, just because of where she lives or what she looks like. Evelyn. Harris deserved the same protection, the same dignity as anyone else. She was treated like a suspect when all she was someone who bakes cookies for her grandkids and tends to tomato plants. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. We find in favor of the plaintiff, the foreperson said, and award damages in the amount of $4 million. Patricia closed her eyes. Evelyn didn't move. Then she smiled. Just a little. The kind of smile that holds more pain than victory, but also more peace than anger. Her son grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. We did it, Mama. Evelyn looked straight ahead, her voice barely louder than a whisper. No. We started something. It had been 3 weeks since the verdict. The headlines had faded, the news vans had moved on, but the dust hadn't truly settled. Not inside Evelyn's heart. Yes, she'd won the case. Yes, the court had called it unjust and reckless. Yes, $4 million had been awarded to her. But every time Evelyn walked through her home, she still stepped carefully, like the fear might return if she moved too freely. Some of the rooms had been repainted. The front door was replaced, stronger, with new locks and a security system her son insisted on. Contractors came and went. Neighbors offered help. But Evelyn still found herself staring at the same walls, trying to hear the silence that used to live there. The good kind of silence. The soft peace of routine, of safety, of belonging. One afternoon, she stood in her garden for the first time in months. The plants were gone, all of them. But the soil remained. It felt dry beneath her hands at first. Unfamiliar. Then, slowly, she started digging her fingers in. It surprised her, how good it felt. Not because she'd forgotten, but because it reminded her of who she used to be, before they made her feel like a suspect in her own home. She spent that whole afternoon outside, sleeves rolled up, sweat on, her brow pulling weeds and loosening the earth, not to erase what had happened, but to start again. Later that evening, her son brought her a folder. "From Patricia," he said, handing it over with a smile. Inside were documents, some neatly typed, others handwritten, suggestions for charitable giving, ideas for community support, and a personal letter. At the end of it, Patricia had written one simple line. "What they took was personal. What you give back can be powerful." Evelyn sat with that idea for days. She thought about how the police had seen her house, how they didn't see her, how her name, her life, her story hadn't mattered until the damage had already been done. What if that could change? What if the next time something like this happened, someone actually had someone to turn to? Not just a lawyer, not just a news crew, but a person, a place, a movement. That's when the idea came. She called Patricia the next morning and said, "I want to use the money to help others, but not just with words. I want to build something." And she did. 6 months later, Evelyn stood in front of a newly painted storefront just 5 blocks from her house. A hand-painted wooden sign above the door read, "The Cedar Street Justice Initiative. For dignity, for safety, for all." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't political. It was just hers. Inside, the shelves were lined with pamphlets about civil rights, emergency housing programs, free legal aid. In the corner, a bookshelf held donated books for kids whose parents had been arrested during mistaken raids. There were phone chargers, spare diapers, care kits, warm socks, simple things that made people feel like they mattered. Evelyn sat at the front desk most mornings. She greeted everyone the same way, with soft eyes and a warm voice. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. She started small. One family, wrongly evicted during a mistaken drug raid. A young man, arrested because he fit the description. A mother whose door was broken down while her baby slept. Each time, Evelyn listened, took their hand, shared her story, not to center herself, but to show them they weren't alone. And the neighborhood changed. People talked more openly about what happened to them. They came to the center for help, but also just to be seen, to be heard. Word spread. Donations came in. Volunteers signed up. Evelyn's name started appearing in places she never imagined. In articles, at meetings, even on panels about community reform. But she always returned to the same chair by the garden window in her home, the place where she used to sit and do crosswords. Now she kept a journal there. One evening, her granddaughter came over and helped her stake the new tomato, plants they'd planted weeks before. "You think they'll grow again?" the little girl asked. Evelyn smiled. "If we take care of them, baby, just like we take care of people." A few days later, a police car slowly rolled down Cedar Street. Not in a rush, no sirens, just passing by. The officer waved at Evelyn sitting on her porch. She waved back, not because she'd forgotten, not because she'd forgiven everything, but because she wasn't afraid anymore, and because waving was something she chose, not something taken from her. Back inside, the walls of her home were slowly filling again, with new photos, smiling faces from the center, handwritten thank you notes, newspaper clippings about the foundation's first year. A framed dollar bill, the first donation from a neighbor who'd said, "You gave me hope." But beside all of that, the most important photo still hung quietly by the door. James, smiling in his postal uniform. The photo they'd saved after the raid, the one Evelyn refused to throw out, even with the cracked glass. Every morning, before she opened the door to the world, she touched that frame and whispered, "We're doing good, honey. We're doing good." And then, she'd walk out into her garden, or into the little Justice Center, or simply down Cedar Street, knowing her pain had bloomed into something with roots, not revenge, not rage, but purpose. A full year had passed since the morning. The SWAT team shattered Evelyn's front door. 12 months since they'd stormed in, rifles raised, shouting orders at a woman still in her bathrobe. Since she'd been forced to the ground in her own hallway. Since her garden had been trampled, her keepsakes scattered, and her safety torn away. But now, Cedar Street looked different. Not because the trees had grown taller or the sidewalks had been repaved, but because something invisible had changed. A feeling, a knowing. The kind of shift that can't be measured in inches, only in hearts. The neighborhood was alive again. Children played in front yards without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Porch lights stayed on late into the night, not out of fear, but out of welcome. Police cars still patrolled, but they stopped now. They waved. Sometimes they got out and spoke to people by name. And Evelyn? She was no longer just the woman in the robe on the news, no longer the face of a tragic mistake. She had become a guidepost, a voice, a living, breathing reminder that dignity, once stripped, can be reclaimed and shared. The Cedar Street Justice Initiative had grown. What began as a single office with a few volunteers had expanded into a citywide network. They now had lawyers on call, counselors for trauma victims, and a youth mentoring program for kids growing up in over-policed neighborhoods. But Evelyn kept her mornings the same. She still woke early, still brewed her tea, still spent an hour in her garden before the city could pull her in a dozen different directions. Her tomatoes were thriving. Her peppers were bold and red. And beside the gate, she'd planted something new, a fig tree. It was James's favorite fruit. One warm spring morning, Evelyn stood outside the center's entrance, straightening the open sign, when her granddaughter tugged her sleeve. "Grandma, are we still doing the butterfly thing today?" Evelyn smiled and nodded. "Yes, baby. We're ready." That day, Cedar Street wasn't closed for tragedy. It was closed for celebration. Folding tables lined the street, covered in fresh food, handmade signs, and framed photographs of people the foundation had helped. Music played softly from a speaker set near the garden. And from porch to porch, neighbors laughed, shared stories, and passed lemonade like they used to, long before that awful morning. At the center of it all stood Evelyn, dressed simply in a pale yellow blouse and soft blue skirt. Her hair neatly pulled back, her voice calm but certain as she stepped to a microphone set up in front of her garden. The crowd, neighbors, friends, students, police officers, even a few city officials, fell quiet. Evelyn cleared her throat gently. "A year ago today, I was made to feel like I didn't belong in my own home. Like I didn't matter. Like I was dangerous." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the street. But I wasn't the only one. That kind of treatment, it's happened. To people who never got a chance to speak about it, who never got an apology, who never got justice. She took a deep breath. "This isn't just my story. It's our story. And what we've built here, together, is proof that healing is possible. That change isn't just a word. It's action. It's community. It's truth." Then, she turned toward her grandchildren. "Let's set them free now." Each child stepped forward, holding a small box. With a soft countdown, they opened them, and dozens of monarch butterflies floated into the sky. Their wings caught the light, flickering like bits of gold against the blue. The crowd gasped, smiled, cried, and Evelyn, she looked up at the butterflies, hands folded, a small tear running down her cheek. But it wasn't from sadness. It was from peace. After the event, as the tables were folded and the last guests hugged goodbye, Evelyn walked home slowly. Her feet hurt a little, but her heart felt light. She stepped through her front door, new, secure, but still painted the soft, buttery color James had loved, and paused in the hallway. The picture of him in his postal uniform now hung beside newer ones. Her with the mayor at the reform bill signing, her grandchildren holding a banner. At the community march, the foundation staff celebrating their first 100 cases won. Each photo was a mile marker, proof that survival had become purpose. That night, Evelyn sat on her porch with a warm blanket across her lap. The air was cool, the sky full of stars. Across the street, porch lights glowed. Laughter drifted faintly from an open window. Her son stepped outside and sat beside her. "Looks like they finally fixed the streetlight," he said, nodding toward the corner. Evelyn smiled. "Took 'em long enough." A quiet moment passed. "You proud?" he asked her softly. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked at her garden, at the butterflies still dancing somewhere above the rooftops, and at the peaceful street in front of her. "I'm not just proud," she said finally. "I'm grateful that I had something left to give, and that people were ready to receive it." Her son leaned over and kissed her temple. "You gave them more than something. You gave them strength." Later that night, before heading to bed, Evelyn stood by the fig tree. The moonlight caught on its new leaves. She reached out and gently touched one of them, then looked up toward the stars. "Thank you, James," she whispered. "We made it. We really made it." And with that, she stepped back inside. She locked the door once, just once. Not out of fear, out of habit. Because peace had returned. Not the fragile kind that comes from silence and pretending nothing ever happened. But the strong kind, the kind you grow with your hands, fight for with your voice, and pass down to every child who asks why butterflies fly free. Evelyn Harris had been broken once, but she rebuilt. And in doing so, she reminded the world that even a grandmother in a garden can change everything. One truth, one plant, one promise at a time.